Welcome to the Kind Heartfulness podcast, exploring the inner reaches of the heart and mind, brought to you by Rangjung Yeshe Institute, Germany-Austria, and your host, Eric Solomon.
Welcome to another episode of the Kind Heartfulness podcast, and in this episode we speak with Dr. Christina Lopes, a Buddhist practitioner and accomplished anthropologist, about how living traditions evolve. In Tibetan Buddhism, great importance is placed on the purity of lineage, the idea that essential teachings are preserved through an unbroken chain of oral transmission from master to disciple. But lineage is more than preservation. As we engage with the teachings, something is passed down, but something new is also born. A truly living lineage must be both rooted and responsive. It preserves the past while adapting to the present. Dr. Lopes brings a rare and valuable perspective to this conversation, exploring how contemporary practitioners participate in a dynamic lineage that is continually shaped by experience, culture, and insight. Dr. Cristina focuses on the translation and study of sutras, particularly the Buddhāvataṃsakasūtra. Cristina received her PhD in Anthropology from the University of Sao Paulo and her MA in Buddhist Studies from Columbia University. She studied Classical Tibetan as part of her PhD research and postdocs at Columbia and Harvard Universities and at the Rangjung Yeshe Institute. Cristina was faculty at University of Virginia and UNC-Greensboro. She also taught at RYI-Austria, which also hosts this podcast, and Stanford University, where she's visiting fellow at the Center for South Asia. She's the author of Tibetan Buddhism in Diaspora, Cultural Re-signification in Practice and Institutions. So join me in welcoming her to the podcast. Dr. Cristina Lopes, welcome to the Kind Heartfulness podcast.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Actually, there's a couple people at Gomde that keep saying to me, is she going to be on the podcast? When is she going to be on the podcast? So, I felt this kind of special pressure. But it was also, having met you a couple times, I'm really happy that we can actually have you here today. And what I'd like to talk to you about, and maybe even say pick your brain about, is because you're an anthropologist and have studied this whole process of Tibetan Buddhism coming into the modern world, and maybe just we could start there and then find something to drill down on about how is that. I think let me give it some context that people often think like there's something that's been perfectly preserved, some lineage that's often the language that's used, perfectly preserved, and now it's here and I can taste it in exactly the same way that a Tibetan practitioner would taste it 150 years ago. Do you think that's a valid way to look at it?
In a certain sense, for sure, it is a valid way of looking at it. Mm. But, and I think that what you touch upon here is really, in a way, like the nature of tradition. What is a tradition? Like, we tend to think about traditions as something more or less frozen time or something like that. A lot of times I feel like people miss out on the very dynamism that animates every single tradition. Mm. So when we think about traditions, instead of just thinking about things being kind of preserved, we should also, in a way, look at it like in terms of its dynamism, in terms of its changes. And that's what kind of keeps a tradition alive. No tradition would survive if it was something kind of, not dynamic enough to change. If it was something like kind of unchangeable. So this is something that, but at the same time, whenever we engage, and especially when we engage with like a no tradition like Buddhism, or more specifically Tibetan Buddhism, we really feel like we are connecting with something that is kind of exists through time. There's something that's there too. There's a line, a lifeline that never dies. So that's really something that creates this interesting thing about traditions. It's always has always two faces: the face of preservation and the face of like really change. So in a way, I think, when we engage, so to go back to your question, when we engage with like an old tradition like that, like a more than 1,000 years Tibetan Buddhism, we are engaging with something that's quite old, but also we are engaging with this modern form, and it could not be different, right? Because we are different people already. So, and the engagement never happens from one side. It's always like has also like a very dynamic kind of thing about it. So, it gotta be different and it gotta be the same at the same time.
So
right.
I think that speaks to me in my own experience as a practitioner in this tradition. So, but how do you see it changing then? Or maybe if that's too big a question, you could just give me an example of how you see it changing.
So a good example of what you're asking about how Tibetan Buddhism is changing in this new context it is encountering. And there are many. It's not only the modern, what we call the modern world. There's always the modern world in a way. We are all there. But it's beyond the West, for sure. Yeah. And like the other day, not so long ago, I read, I peer-reviewed a paper about Tibetan Buddhism in Vietnam. And that was very interesting. So it's there too. Yeah. And but to go back to your question and the example that I think it's quite a paradigmatic example of the kinds of changes we are talking about is Tara's Triple Excellence, which is this amazing program created by Chogyam Rinpoche's students under his guidance, especially Heidi Koppel and Lama Tenzin. And in this program, it is everything is electronic, right? The whole relationship with the tradition is basically not the whole, but I mean, at some points there are in-person initiations. I think that Chogyam Rinpoche wants the initiations to be in person most of the time. And so there are these cases, but a lot of times you practice at home, guided by the program, the teachings that were so carefully arranged in this program, and then I think during the pandemic they even created this facilitating groups with someone who was responsible to help the group progress, or at least, a kind of a space where you could just connect to other practitioners and clarify doubts or simply practice together. So that's something quite new.
Yes.
Even though, like, the first, I remember I even read a paper about it not so long ago, very interesting paper about the first ritual online. And it was something like, maybe it was in the 80s or the early 90s, maybe. And it was just like typing, now it's happening this, now it's happening that. So we are a little bit beyond that.
Yeah.
And so we have this amazing kind of thing. And then you have these teachings that are being translated in many different languages. So we have the creation of a real kind of global sangha, a global community of practitioners, which is something that was quite unimaginable before. And that's, of course, something that came with the diaspora of Tibetan Buddhism already. The way the lamas were just kind of going around doing the old stuff. Again, tradition. We're talking about traditionally, how does it happen? Somebody, from another valley invites a lama to come, offers some kind of donation or offering, and the lama comes and then gives the teaching. So it's not very different, but at that point, the scale is global. So that's one difference. So again, you have things that people are just doing things in the traditional ways, but the context is different. So the result of it will also be different in that sense. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm curious about that. So what kind of result, in which way might it be different? I suspect you're right, but I'm trying to think of myself as you said that.
I mean, in terms of how do you connect? I mean, how do these people you have these groups of people practicing green Tara together or connected practices, and they're doing that online. They even have an amazing 3D model of visualization of Tara, and that's something also that it's a little bit different from tankas, traditional tankas, but still, I mean, I interviewed the person who created this 3D video with Tara, green Tara, and she talked to a very, very traditional lama here in Nepal, trying to know precisely how she should draw this and that. So again, there's some tradition. The tradition is there still, yes, but it's kind of being manifested in different ways. Mm-hmm. It's being kind of the final result of it is like a 3D video, which is something we could not imagine before.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because it seemed to me that one of the first things I had to do when I was trying to visualize a mandala is I was looking at a very flat, cartoony, because that's traditionally how it's painted, image of a deity. And then in my mind, trying to imagine it as some kind of translucent, three-dimensional thing. And that does seem different than looking at something, even if it's a 2D painting, tanka, but painted within modern perspective, like the Europeans have been doing for hundreds of years, right? I think it's a different activity. I don't know how that exactly affects my practice, but I can see that it's engaging with that would be very different.
Yes.
Let alone a 3D model.
Yeah. But I think that the main thing is connecting with other people, mm-hmm, and also the guru, the lama. So, and you can do that, wherever you are now, in a way. Of course, there is still a difference between seeing the lama, the guru in person, or practicing in person, and sure, doing it at your home. But still, it's something that's quite different in a way. But of course, there is much more than that. That's just a very, maybe even extreme example of, the usage of modern technology to kind of foster the practice. But there are many other examples that have more to do with, the new connections that are formed, who is paying for the monasteries, who is, what kind of balance you ended up encountering in this new context, like in terms of, who's going to be the sponsors, who's going to be, and
the whole meaning of Sangha and how they interact with the heart of the mandala, you're saying it is definitely quite different than when you have feudal situation, and a king or queen was granting monastery land, and with that came serfs and a way to grow crops that created an income of sorts, and the monastery could survive quite okay. And then, of course, sponsors came and helped additionally. Now it's a very different, it's a different world, a different way of supporting the Dharma.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways better, in some ways more challenging.
Yeah, very much so.
I don't think either of us are pining away to go live in some sort of feudal situation, but so we have to say we at least experience it in some ways better, but there are some downsides, which is that the monasteries themselves are much less secure.
Yeah, we do not. We don't have now. I mean, Tibetan doesn't have, especially in the case of like sects like Gelugpa sect.
Mm-hmm.
The structure of the state kind of supporting it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's all gone. So,
but Tugorjan said that one reason he thought like Tibet was very wealthy compared to Nepal when he first came out of Tibet, and was well in Tibet, and he differentiated, by the way, between Kham and Tibet. That's important for this conversation. I don't know if it's important, but he did make that. He said that, well, in Tibet, everybody's paying their taxes to Avalokiteshvara. So, of course, it's a different effect than when you just pay them to a king.
Yeah. That's exactly just what I said.
Yeah. It is exactly what you said. It's funny. Of course, he had his own sort of framework he was speaking out of, if you can say that about a master like that. I think you can in this case, it's interesting. So what does that mean if I go to a modern Dharma center? Like I met you in Gomde, Austria, the first time, and the first time that we met, and so how do you think that affects then our engagement with the tradition? Does it?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, everything affects like the way we as lay practitioners engage with Tibetan Buddhism already is something that is quite different from what it was in the past, right? At least, I mean, we have our jobs, we do other stuff, and we consider ourselves very serious practitioners, or at least try to. Or, our goal is not like, they have a good life now, maybe, have a better rebirth in which we can practice well. I mean, we can have this kind of goal too. But my general impression, and that might be just my own personal experience, is that the way people in Europe, in Brazil, in the States engage with Tibetan Buddhism when they are not monastic, is also very serious. And it tries to be. I'm not saying that everybody's serious, but there is an idea that we can be. And that was not necessarily the case so much like in more traditional societies. It was a different relationship people had. There are many ways of acquiring, gathering merit, right?
Yes.
So you can do it by making donations. We can do it by, having a ritual done for you, for your family, or things like that. And even though people engage like that, too, but there are other ways of engaging that maybe were not so prominent in these more traditional societies. And that's something like going to Bhutan. for instance. Then even now in Nepal too, this is changing too, of course. Then we see a lot, especially here in Nepal, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche has a lot of Nepali students who are also, working people. They're doing all this stuff, but they are, practicing also seriously. So that's a big change, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, in Nepal in particular, when I first started going to Nepal, there were very few Nepalis, especially upper caste Nepalis, who want anything to do with Buddhism. But it's interesting because it's my impression that the Nepalis who are coming to Buddhism now are as much of the modern world as my European friends or my American friends. I mean, of course, every culture is different. The way Americans approach Buddhism is sometimes a little different than the way Germans do, to be overly simplistic. And so, of course, Nepalis, again, are slightly different. But it still seems to me that it's this modern world orientation rather than pre-modern, if I can say it like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I totally agree with you. It's but that's in a way a little bit of a result, not of this the Tibetan diaspora. So these lamas coming first to these Asian countries and then going all around the world. So that already changed the whole dynamic of things.
Yes.
And I feel like the lamas are quite happy about that too.
Yeah, sure.
It's not that they're never too attached to some idea of what a tradition is. I think that their view of things is quite broad in that way.
I've watched Tsoknyi Rinpoche over the time that I've known him really kind of fundamentally change the way he brings people into the Dharma based on things he's observed in the modern world that cause, he would say, problems in the subtle body that you wouldn't find in an agrarian feudal society. You find them in a hyper modern, urban, always on wired world society. And not that that's changed Buddhist philosophy that he teaches, but it's definitely changed the pedagogy a lot. And he'd be the first one to admit it. I mean, he tells very amusing stories, wondering why traditional way of presenting meditation wasn't working for any of his students. They used to do that. So.
Yeah, so to go back also, so in relation to what you're saying, and to go back to one thing that you said at the beginning, like in terms of what changes in terms of meaning. And I would say that the meaning, I mean, if you think about the meaning of the Dharma and the ideas, not necessarily changing so much, I would say. I don't think that changes. So that's something, I mean, it always change. It has to change because it's like the way you kind of relate to it. It's a relational thing. Already it's going to change, according to the persons it's being put in contact with. So we have that. But in a way, I think that the meaning of things, the goals, and a lot of things are still the same. Isn't it how the French say, plus ça change, plus ça devient les mêmes. So it's a little bit like that, right? So maybe.
Yeah, I think in English we say it too, something like the more things change, the more they remain the same. It's something like that.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
I don't have to show off my French.
Well, we have a very international audience. Probably some of them looks like some people. This may have been the one part they understood very clearly. So, I get what you're saying. I see it maybe perhaps more of the social relationships we have as Dharma students is different, and I think the pedagogy is changing. And I think we've seen this even as Buddhism has gone from country to country historically, right? The way that what was emphasized in one part of China was different than the way it was taught in, say, Japan or in Tibet, even though they're all studying from the same philosophical texts. Right? So the meaning, the ultimate meaning is the same, but then the pedagogy is a little different from place to place.
Yeah, definitely. It cannot be otherwise, right?
Yeah. So then how does this affect you affect you as a practitioner? Does it affect you as a practitioner? Do you, when you practice, how does it inform your spiritual life, if I may ask?
What exactly?
This awareness of how the tradition isn't static but dynamic, or it's both static and dynamic. It isn't only static. Yeah.
Yeah, that, I mean, might be just my way of being, but I think that the way I think about tradition helped me to be open to a lot of stuff, a lot of things, of like being in contact with the Dharma, like through different ways, like the films of Dzogchen Khyentse Rinpoche, for instance, something that can touch you very much. I mean, this is an amazing Lama, so I guess it cannot be otherwise. But I think it can. But for sure, this. I mean, just to be open to this kind of things and not to have a very conservative mind. I think it's helpful also to engage with the Dharma, because the Dharma is not really, it seems to me, it's not really about these formats. That it comes in packages, but, it's beyond that in a way. So to see the kind of the proliferation of it all is also helpful in the sense of trying to get to something more kind of maybe essential, even though I don't like this word so much. Yeah. But at least if you see like the different kind of, configurations of things, like how a teaching can be conveyed in different ways, and you understand also something about this malleability of, the flexibility. Malleability of the Dharma.
Yeah.
So
thank you for speaking English. I'm really grateful. It's we could be doing this in Portuguese or something, but I appreciate you making the effort to speak in English.
Yeah, almost these days it's almost an effort to speak in Portuguese. So I'm gonna become lingual very soon.
Yeah, that's happening to me too.
Yeah, so it shows a little bit of this. I don't know. I think it helps you keep open to whatever. And in a way, this tradition or the traditions we engage with in Tibetan Buddhism are very much about that, right? Very much like everything is a teaching, right? Mm-hmm. So if everything is a teaching, can be a teaching. Mm-hmm. The whole world can be teaching you. If you see like a leaf falling from a tree, and that makes you think about impermanence, and that kind of creates, that can be seen as a teaching too. So I think that to understand, to see tradition in this kind of very flexible way can also be a good way of just relating to the amazing, kind of openness of Buddhism. And yeah.
Yeah, for me, it was really an eye-opener. It's like unconsciously, I think I was always approaching practice like there's the practice you're doing, and then there's these key commentaries that have been written, and all this happened some time ago. And so I was working with a translator for this one Guru Sadhana that the Sangha I was involved with was practicing, and translating a commentary on it. And actually, this commentary was written in probably, I don't know, somewhere between 1930 and 1950. So that was already, that's pretty modern. And then we discovered this Khenpo, this very realized Khenpo in Tibet, has a commentary he wrote in the last 15 years, And so I was thinking of it as there's some kind of static tradition that we were part of preserving. Now we're bringing it into the English language.
Yeah.
And then suddenly realizing that, wow, what we're doing, yes, it's informed by this thing written in the 40s and another thing written in the 90s or even early 2000s, but why should it stop there? That maybe, and maybe even our translation would lead to some European Mahasiddha one day writing a commentary in modern language. It could be. Hopefully, if we were really successful, this helps a few people realize. But that also led me to another kind of realization, which is that, because I'm in several sanghas and they all have their tradition of translation and they all translate the same prayers slightly differently, which exposes different meanings. And I'm just wondering where all of that's going. So everybody is, kind of trying to say the same thing. Well, they're saying the same thing when they do the transliterated Tibetan, but then they say the English or the German, or even I've discovered the German, as I teach at Gomde, the German actually is slightly different in meaning than the English. And then again from the Tibetan. And I don't think any of them are wrong. Although sometimes it seems one is more right than the others, but I don't think any of them are exactly wrong. I'm just wondering, because you're working a lot in translating sutras and things like that. Where's this going?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, so much has happened already, in a way, in terms because Buddhism wasn't mainly, because it initially developed in India, right? And it was already translated in so many other languages. But, we could even say that that's part of the very nature of Buddhism, actually. Buddha supposedly said to his disciples, so whatever he was preaching, he said, so you go now and translate it into your own languages. And that means, in a way, that Buddhism could be considered the first transcultural kind of religion in the world, because language, especially at the time in which Buddhism was kind of forming, is something that was sacred, tend to be sacred. You tend to have your sacred language. You have, Sanskrit, you have a lot of sacred languages. And Buddha had no problem with that. And I find that fascinating.
Yes.
And that shows, again, to come back to this idea, I think that all traditions are like that.
Yes.
Dynamic.
Yes.
They change all the time. But Buddhism is more, it's explicitly like that.
Yes.
I mean, if there is no change, there is no tradition. There's no way a tradition can survive without change. Yeah. So I think we're going somewhere. God knows where. I don't know God, maybe, but nobody would know.
Nobody knows.
Maybe some do. Yeah. But the main thing is we are doing what has to be done. And this translating, that's the reason why 84,000 was created by Dzongda Khyentse Rinpoche, right? Like that's his initiative. And I remember a lot of people thinking like, why translate all of that? Nobody reads that. It's something you just put in your shrine and do prostrations to. But of course, it is and it isn't, because like, who reads Kant? We have a lot of stuff that is not read by the whole society, but still informs the society. It's still part of the intellectual inheritance of the society. So, I mean, this is a way of not having also an incomplete tradition, by translating this very kind of fundamental works. And but there'll be differences. There'll be, I particularly deal with very difficult texts. I'm translating the Buddhāvataṃsakasūtra in particular. And sometimes it's on the almost not understandable what's in the text, because there are many reasons for that. But probably the source text, the Sanskrit source text, was quite complicated too. He had a lot of long compounds, which is something very particular to Sanskrit language. And these compounds, they don't have much grammar. So to break them and to translate them into some other language that doesn't have the same kind of logic, it's not that easy. So a lot of times, it's quite difficult to deal with this text, quite rewarding too in the end, after some suffering. But it's
yes.
But even today I was thinking about that. It's like, that was encounter a sentence. It was like, what does it mean? It can mean this, it can mean that. And in the end, I'll be choosing the meaning. The final meaning.
In some cases, it can mean both. And yet,
exactly.
And then how do you reflect that?
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes the ambiguity is lost in our languages. Like a word like Dharma is the most classic kind of example of that has so many meanings. And sometimes you can see in the text they are playing with these meanings, using it all the time. And we have to translate in 5 different ways. So the ambiguity is totally lost, the inter kind of connection between the sentences is lost. But that's it. Things are, there is also in Italian, there is a saying what is it? I can't remember. It's translating is betraying. Or something like that, but in Italian it sounds much better. I can't remember now the sentence.
I've heard someone else talk about it. It's also on the tip of my tongue. Yeah, but it's beautiful.
It's beautiful, and it is. We are betraying something.
Yes.
We have to, try to pray not to betray too much, and to get the closest possible to the meaning. But something remains at the same time. There is something about it. Translation is possible. So, in the same way that the coming of Tibetan Buddhism to the West was also possible, because it is a kind of translation or re-signification, as you mentioned, which is not. You can use translation in the same way. It means it's a slightly more kind of arrogant way of saying just translation. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, maybe. I think that, though, what it's really pointing to is that the meaning in some way changes. And because meaning isn't just found in the word, it's found in the context. And part of the context is the world we're living in today. And I suppose part of what Dzogchen Khyentse Rinpoche is what's driving some of this drive to get everything translated, is that now you still have not only people who understand the old style of Tibetan that a lot of these texts were written in, but you have people who are part of the lineage of even, I'm going to say translation, even though they were teaching in Tibetan, they were making that old Tibetan's meaning come alive in their students' minds. And so now you have people who can translate into, say, English, but they can still go to some of these old masters and say, do I understand this properly before I go translate it? I just need to check. And then also, because you're all in a group, you can check with each other, because each of you has had everybody carries some of what they got from their masters, their teachers. And so I think that, that it could be true that within a generation or two, that will be lost if we don't do something now. So I suppose it's like an insurance policy.
And also, the way things are going in China sometimes, like the Tibetan language is not being put into value, let's put it that way, and sometimes
understatement. Yeah.
Yes. So,
like kids aren't allowed to
right
speak
now, right now I have some people who can understand Tibetan, can read Tibetan, can translate. Right. This old Tibetan, that's it's not the same. And also the language of the sutras and what's said in the sutras can be quite different from what, like the most kind of current teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. Is a kind of a different thing. So anyway, but yeah, I think that there is some kind of insurance in that sense, especially because now it is still a good moment for that. We don't know how it's going to be in the future. You have like a lot of cases, even in European universities, in which like the positions of like Tibetan Buddhist studies are being closed down and things like that. So, we don't know what's going to happen in the future exactly. So right now it's still possible, enough people know it and can be part of this project. But you're right.
Yeah, thanks. I think that thank you for bringing the dynamism of the tradition alive during this podcast. I think it's really important. And I want to ask you to please come back again. It's been wonderful having you here today. And
thank you.
I feel I learned something. I hope our listeners did too, but I can just say personally, I'm very grateful, and it's been time well spent. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks for listening. If you have enjoyed today's podcast, we like to invite you to continue the journey into the heart of enlightened mind at gomde.eu.